Stu. Even though he's only an epic brawler, he has probably one of the most unique abilities in the entire game, being able to charge your super with only one projectile. Not one ammo, only one projectile. Obviously, this made Stu a very complicated brawler to balance, and that brings us to today, and why Stu will most likely never fade out of the meta. Hope you enjoy, and let's start with Stu's release. Stu was originally released in 15th of March 2021, and he had some big differences from the Stu we know nowadays. Even though he had the same HP, back then he dealt 1200 damage per projectile instead of the nowadays 1080, and most importantly, his super dealt knockback. This might sound absolutely ridiculous to some of you, but yes, when Stu was released, he could essentially perma-stun lock most of the tanks and enemies with comboing ammunition and his basic attack. Obviously, this would be patched eventually, but he was released this way. And obviously, he was broken. He was immediately a S tier brawler. There was no other brawler that could do what he did. He dealt good damage, had good HP, and most importantly, he could absolutely overwhelm the enemy with just the insane amount of knockback that he super had. Now, even though Stu was so strong, it would still take a while for him to get nerfed. Actually, there would even be one change to him before getting nerfed, which was the introduction of his second star power. And this is the perfect opportunity to explain you that back then Brawl Stars had a lot of key differences. Brawlers only went up to power 9, and each level only gave you 5% bonus stats instead of the nowadays 10%. Plus, brawler releases back then were a bit different because the brawler when it got released, it would only have his first star power and his first gadget. So yes, this also means that Stu still didn't have his second gadget, which would be important later on, but for now, Stu would only have his first gadget and his first star power. Until 31th of March 2021, he would receive the Gazo Heal Star power, which back then it would heal 8.3% of his maximum HP at maximum level, or more specifically 500 HP, which was pretty good. Even though it's just a little bit more than what it is nowadays, it was a pretty solid addition to his kits. With Stu being so strong and prevalent on the meta, more specifically the best brawler in the game, in 7th of April 2021 they would implement the first nerf to Stu, which would be a HP reduction from 6400 to 6000 and a damage reduction from 1200 to 1160. And this essentially didn't change anything. Stu was really good mainly because of the knockback and the fact that you could get the super so easily. The cycle of supers could not be underestimated at any point, and Stu, even with these changes, would still prevail to be the best brawler in the game. Because of that, just 2 weeks later, in the 22nd of April, his HP would be reduced yet again from 6000 to 5600. And yes, 5600 it's not a lot, but it was just still a lot to deal with. The heal, the damage still, and also the fact that you could cycle super so easily, it didn't really matter that much because Stu was just still a very powerful brawler. And this is another good opportunity to mention that back then, even though his first gadget only had 3 uses, like all of other gadgets, the gadget had no health decay. This meant that in some scenarios, you could get exactly infinite value from your gadget. And this is very important because gadgets should also never be underestimated. So, still having the ability to have almost infinite supers, very fast, and having a gadget that could have infinite value just shows that baseline stats would not be enough to make Stu fall off the S tier.
It's nothing!
Now, 2 months later, more precisely in the 16th of June 2021, Supercell would do the unthinkable. they would completely remove the knockback of Stu's super. This was a completely unexpected change. Yes, even though his super was very toxic, Supercell usually doesn't do these much mechanical changes to a super. This was for sure a very special treatment to Stu. And it was a complicated time because people couldn't really tell what would happen to Stu, mainly because the tank trait was also being added in these updates. And with the tanks being so strong, it wasn't that weird to think that Stu could immediately fall off the meta. But surprisingly, that really wasn't the case. The fact that you still could get your super with just one projectile, it was just really strong. On top of that, I also like to think that a reason to why they removed the knockback was to make sure that Stu would not fall into the category of a tank counter, because obviously knockbacks are one of the biggest counters to tanks, so if Stu could have this ability to counter tanks in one of the most aggressive tank metas in Brawl Stars history, then Stu would just become even more broken, and clearly Supercell knew that. So I think that this was the perfect change, but unfortunately Stu's capability to cycle supers was just still really strong. And like if things couldn't get even more complicated, in 15th of September, Supercell would actually add Stu's second gadget. And let's just say that the gadget was really strong. Back then, the damage that the Shatter Walls would do was 500. Nowadays it only deals 216, so it dealt almost triple the damage in comparison to nowadays, so it was really strong. But on top of that, the gadget instantly gave you the super. And here it's again showing us that Supercell was severely underestimating the super of Stu. It was just a dash, but it was so compelling to his kit that Supercell just underestimated how strong it would be the gadget instantly giving you the super. So, 1 month later, in the 25th of August 2021, the second gadget would receive 2 massive nerfs. The gadget would no longer give you the super, and the gadget damage would also be reduced from a whopping 500 to only 200. On top of that, his second star power Gazo Heal would receive a 20% nerf to the healing, which it's pretty impactful, a 20% nerf. It went from 500 heal to 400 heal, which honestly made Stu strong still, but nowhere near as broken as he used to be. The fact that you could no longer just get a super with a gadget was really a relief, and the fact that you just couldn't heal as much with the super, it made cycling supers not as oppressive, because Stu would just heal his HP while rushing towards the enemies would just create a lot of pressure, and the fact that this pressure was reduced, it made Stu a lot weaker. Still a A-tier brawler, but overall strong. And now I want to emphasize something very important. I am mainly talking about high level of gameplay, because in lower ladder, Stu was not as good, because lower ladder is obviously a lot more chaotic, and let's say that because of these changes, Stu actually became a little bit more skilled. So at this point, it wasn't anyone that could just play Stu and immediately get value. You needed to be aware of the cycle of supers, being able to heal as much as possible, and get good timings with your gadgets, which was something that not everybody could do. Unfortunately for Stu, there would still be more nerfs in his way. In 25th of January 2022, he would receive another damage nerf, going from 1160 per projectile to the nowadays 1080 damage per projectile. This was another good nerf. Stu would no longer be nearly as offensive. Remember, Stu is an assassin, so being able to deal damage, it's really important to do your function, and still getting a damage nerf would impact him quite a lot. Even though Stu it's not like most assassins, having damage would be very important if you wanted to dash towards an enemy to get to the guaranteed damage of your 3 ammo. So this was an effective nerf for sure, but still, he was a A-tier brawler. Good in almost everything with the exception of Heist because he didn't have that much damage potential. And again, the damage nerf made Stu significantly weaker against higher HP brawlers, so Stu would now have less favorable 1v1 matchups. Even after another half a year later, Stu would still prevail in the A tier, surviving the test of time, and clearly the nerfs weren't still impacting him enough. But there would be a very important thing that would happen with his second gadget, where now you could activate the gadget without the super. And if this makes you confused, let me explain. You couldn't activate your gadget if you didn't have the super. Now, it sounds weird, but that was just how the gadget worked back then. But this came with a weird bug because, again, the gadget was giving him the super entirely. So Stu was back. His gadget giving him the super was broken. Stu went immediately back to the S tier, because the fact that you could get your first super from the gadget and break walls, just like with the press of one green button, was just really strong. And this proved again that Stu's super should never be underestimated. Now, it didn't took too long to fix the bug. Around 2 weeks later, in 19th of October 2022, the gadget would no longer give the super. Now, for some reason, Supercell thought because of this bug correction, Stu actually deserved a buff for some reason, so they give him a very tiny HP buff, increasing his HP from 5600 to 5800. At the time, it really didn't make sense because Stu was strong even before the bug, so it was for sure a very weird change, but at the same time, it was just 200 bonus HP, so it wouldn't really do too much. Finally, in the 25th of October 2022, Stu's first gadget would receive a nerf. Now the first gadget would have a health decay, losing 300 HP per second, which meant that instead of the gadget lasting potentially forever, the gadget would now have a duration limit in a certain way of 34 seconds, which it's still a lot, but at least it wasn't forever. And this meant that any attack onto the gadget would have value, because back then, it only really mattered if you dealt the 1000 damage. If you dealt less than it, it was not enough. With this change, any damage to the gadget would be welcome, and this made the first gadget a little bit easier to counter. But after exactly 364 days, in the 24th of October 2023, Stu would have a couple changes to his second gadget and to his second star power, because Power 10 and Power 11 were introduced, and all of the star powers would get reworked to now scale with the level, and Stu was one of the few that got really benefited from this change. His Gazo heal at maximum level would now heal 580 HP instead of 400, and his second gadget would now deal 216 damage instead of 200 damage. Now, the second gadget buff doesn't really change much, but the Gazo heal buff, that was really important. Stu was back to just healing a lot with his super, and that made pressuring with your super as Stu a lot easier, which was not game breaking, but it helps Stu a little bit. And Supercell would actually give Stu another technical buff in the 12th of December 2023, where enemies standing on his fire trail would now reset the fire duration. Explaining. So if you just stayed on Stu's fire, it didn't actually increase the duration. It would always be 4 seconds of burning, which now it would no longer be the case. If you stayed for some reason on his fire, the duration would get resetted and potentially be extended to 5, 6, 7 or maybe even 8 seconds, which was a small buff, but it was still a very important detail. On top of that, his super would now recharge itself, only by 5% for each tick, so realistically speaking, it would be very rare for you to get your super back from burning the enemies. It would take more than burning the entire enemy team down for you to get your super, so very unrealistic for that to happen, but later on, it would come in handy. So up until now, Stu still haven't dropped below the A tier. But all of that wouldn't really matter too much because mutations were coming to the game. I will explain in a second why this is important, but essentially in a couple of select game modes in the game mode page, there will be the mutation icon. And if you were playing on the mutation icon, all of the brawlers, or the majority of them, had some sort of buff, either their basic attack, stats, or their super. And Stu had a very unique mutation. He had infinite supers. So again, Supercell underappreciating the value of a Stu super, and Stu's mutation was probably one of the strongest. But just 5 days later, in the 3rd of May 2024, the mutation would now nerf the Gazo heal by 50%. Because what would a lot of people do was just to spam the super against a wall and essentially get infinite heals. So now the mutation kinda fixed it. So, 17 days later, 20th of May 2024, mutations were removed and Brawl Stars was back to normal. Almost. At this time, Supercell would implement some pretty interesting reworks to Frank, Lily, and Meg. And who could have guessed, all of those 3 brawlers became insanely broken. And this was actually completely awful for Stu, because Stu couldn't handle a fight with either one of those 3 brawlers. Frank was too tanky, Meg had 2 lives and was too tanky and had the heal catches, and Lily was a low HP brawler counter, and Stu didn't had much HP, so Lily would just obliterate Stu before he could even react. So for the first time in Brawl Stars history, Stu would go down to the B tier. This was truly historical. Stu was never seen by even good players as a balanced brawler, but for the first time, because the meta was just so chaotic, people just simply couldn't get value from Stu. Stu was no tank counter, and Stu was just simply a pressure brawler that also had assassination potential. But in the meta that we were having, it was just impossible to get that. So Stu would stay on the B tier.
Crash and burn, get fixed, return!
With Stu finally being balanced, Supercell would do something quite unthinkable, honestly. They would buff Stu. In the 27th of August 2024, Stu would receive a pretty generous HP buff, going from 5,800 to 6,400. And on top of that, the Gazo heal effect would be increased from 580 to 640 heal per super. Now, this was really surprising because even though Stu was nowhere near as strong as he used to be, Stu was by no means a weak brawler. Not at all. Especially if you consider that back then, Stu still didn't had his hypercharge. So a good reason to his weakness was the fact that he still didn't get a hypercharge. And most people truly believed that when Stu would get a hypercharge, he would get back to the meta. But apparently, Supercell had different plans and decided to buff his HP. And who could have guessed he was back to the meta? Some would even say that he was S tier, although a bit of a stretch, but what mattered was that Stu was strong again. Or at least for 1 month. Surprisingly, Stu actually ended up falling down to the B tier again. Stu just kinda lacked the damage. He was an assassin in the end of the day, and he wasn't just assassinating enemies. The second gadget was really powerful, but he only had 3 per match. The other gadget, was good, but it could be destroyed. The Gazo heal was good, and Stu was essentially a pressure brawler that dealt well with most brawlers, unless they could outrange him or had a chunky amount of HP. And Stu just wasn't good enough. He wasn't bad by any means, but he wasn't what he used to be at his prime.
One will kill!
Which is why in 4th of November 2024 his hypercharge would be added. And what would happen with a couple of hypercharges after the mutation event was that they would be the same as the mutation. And still was one of those cases. You had infinite supers while you were hypercharged. The only catch was that you needed to have the first super, so it wasn't like you activate the hypercharge you immediately get the super. So it would actually be more correct to say that whenever you use the super, you would get 1 super back. That's a more corrected translation to what his hypercharge actually does. The issue was the same as his mutation. You could heal infinite amount of health. Every time you used 1 super of the hypercharge, you would get 640 HP, and that just made Stu unkillable. Not to mention that, while hypercharge, you had a 25% damage increase. Remember all of that times where I said that Stu couldn't really kill enemy brawlers? Well, thanks to the hypercharge, now he can. 1350 per shot, it is no joke. And that's a lot of damage, and Stu and his hypercharge together were unstoppable. Stu went immediately back into the S tier. Everything about him was just so strong, and the hypercharge just complemented everything to perfection. Supercell would really have to nerf this hypercharge. So, 3 months later, in the 25th of February 2025, Stu would have a nerf, although not to the hypercharge surprisingly. His second star power would have another 20% nerf to the heal. I say another, but in reality that star power got a previous heal buff, so saying again it's a little bit of an exaggeration really. The percentage of heal that the Gazo would have would be reduced from 10% of your maximum HP to 8%. So instead of healing 640 HP, it would now heal 512. And yes, this was a nerf, especially to his baseline kit, but also to the hypercharge. One of the problems of the hypercharge was just how much it healed you. And a 20% nerf to the healing was good, but a 20% reduction on an infinite amount, it's still an infinite amount, so in the end, it didn't really change too much. Not to mention that this change had a little bit of a bad timing, because at the exact same day, all gadgets would be reworked. Instead of having 3 uses and a 5-second cooldown, each gadget would now have their own individual cooldown, but infinite uses. And Stu would be one of the few brawlers that would have an absurdly broken gadget, which I'm talking about the first gadget. Because the first gadget could last up to 34 seconds and it only had a 23-second cooldown, this meant that you could have again infinite gadgets. And if I had to be honest, I would even say that this is even worse than the gadget had no health decay at all. Because back then you only had 3, so you had to position them somewhat cautiously. Because now you had infinite amount of them, you didn't really need to worry that much, because by the time that turret was even half HP, you already had another one. And you could be way much more aggressive with the turrets, because in 20 seconds you would have another one of those. So even though Stu had a star power nerf, he had one of the largest gadget buffs in the game, and that made Stu, again, an amazing S tier brawler. Luckily, Supercell wouldn't take long to react to these, so in the 27th of March 2025, the first gadget health decay would be drastically increased from 30 damage per second to 100 damage per second. This is a 333% damage increase. It's really insane. The gadget went from 34 seconds to only 10 seconds. A couple of other gadgets also had their durations reduced, but this gadget had the most drastic of them all. And it was fair, the gadget was insanely good, so it makes perfect sense honestly. And now, the gadget was also balanced, but the problem was still there. Stu didn't become broken because of the gadget just made things worse. So Stu would stay till today in the S tier. So, with all of this being said, how could Supercell actually make Stu balanced? Well, I think that there are a lot of ways that they could do this. They could, my favorite opinion, reduce the bonus damage from the hypercharge from plus 25% plus 5%. They could just increase the charge rate needed to get the hypercharge, which would make the hypercharge harder to get, therefore Stu a little bit weaker throughout the entirety of the match. Or they could just go berserker and increase his super cost from 1 projectile to 2 projectiles. This would probably kill him, but you get the idea. Hope you enjoyed today's video. If you liked, do not forget to subscribe, join our Discord server, link in the description, and I'll see you on the next video.